The Ukrainian national revolution, which began 100 years ago in March 1917, opened up new names of personalities of that time. Mikhailo Hrushevsky was the chairman of the Ukrainian Central Rada, parliament of the newly created Ukrainian People's Republic. Volodymyr Vinnychenko headed the government of the UPR. Pavlo Skoropadsky was the hetman of the Ukrainian state. Simon Petlura was the chairman of the Directory of the Ukrainian People's Republic. Yevhen Petrushevich was the president of the Western Ukrainian People's Republic. A worthy place in this list is occupied by Oleksandr Shulhin, the first head of the Foreign Policy Department of Ukraine. He had the difficult task of justifying the presence of Ukraine in European politics.
Це батько і засновник незалежної української дипломатії. Оцим буде сказано все. Він починав.
He is the father and the founder of independent Ukrainian diplomacy. That says it all. He embarked on his mission, namely the revival of diplomacy during the Ukrainian national liberation movement, and he succeeded in doing so at the highest level of professionalism, although he was not a professional diplomat.
Дипломатом, де, очевидно, ми завжди повинні про це пам'ятати і віддавати належне цій.
Obviously, we must always remember that fact and pay tribute to this person. He is the first foreign minister of the Ukrainian People's Republic that initiated the diplomatic affairs of Ukraine.
Дипломатичну працю України.
Oleksandr Shulhin literally burst onto the scene of the Ukrainian national liberation movement of 1917-1921, and that did not happen by accident. Shulhin was born into a patriotic intellectual family in 1889 in Poltava. His father, Yakov Shulhin, a well-known Ukrainian historian, began social activities back in the times of the People's Will. For that, he was arrested and exiled to Siberia for 4 years in 1879. Then he returned to Kiev, where he taught history in local gymnasiums. At the same time, he was feverishly engaged in publishing activities.
І от саме в середовищі сімейному, де приходили от люди, які просякнуті були.
Alexander Shulhin was brought up in a family circle and among people who were imbued with patriotic views about Ukrainians and Ukraine as a country. He absorbed all possible information like a sponge. Given this fact, it is clear to everyone that as a gymnasium student in Kiev, he stood out among his classmates for his fervently pro-Ukrainian views.
Він відрізнявся такими проукраїнськими поглядами.
After graduating from gymnasium with a silver medal, Oleksandr Shulhin entered the St. Petersburg University. After graduation from the Faculty of History and Philology in 1915, Alexander Yakovich gave lectures at the university and taught history in colleges and gymnasiums in Petrograd, or present-day St. Petersburg. During the February Revolution of 1917, Shulhin became an activist of the Ukrainian National Council. In mid-March 1917, he traveled to Ukraine and actively participated in the national liberalization struggle and the development of Ukrainian statehood. At the age of 28, he became a member of the Ukrainian Central Rada, which appointed him Deputy Secretary General of Inner Ethnic Affairs. Sometime later, Shulhin was appointed to the post of Secretary General of International Affairs in the government of the UPR. In his political views, he was a supporter of the autonomy of Ukraine within the Russian Federation. Why autonomy? Why not independence? Because Ukrainian society was not ready to accept independence at that time. In order for that idea to mature in the mindset of Ukrainians, certain tangible things had to be achieved first. Real things which, let us say, the extremely powerful Russian circles in Ukraine at that time could not possibly deny. And that was exactly the notion of autonomy.
Коли раніше йшла мова просто про якусь там максимум автономію України.
While earlier speaking of the autonomy of Ukraine in the Russian Empire at best, talking about the former Russian Empire becoming a federal state and Ukraine becoming one of the equal subjects of that federation was a fairly progressive and even revolutionary step.
Дуже чітка, одна з таких рівноправних суб'єктів цієї федерації, то це був уже такий досить прогресивний революційний крок.
But the provisional government was not in a hurry to satisfy the demands for Ukraine's political autonomy. In Petrograd, the leaders of the Russian Federation were afraid to lose Ukraine with its powerful economic potential. In Russian historical propaganda, Kiev and Ukraine played the role of the sources of the Russian state. Given this fact, the Russians simply could not fathom Ukraine being separate from Russia. Russia could simply not exist without Ukraine, because that was precisely what was taught in schools, universities, and in history courses, and people believed that they had no alternatives to the Russian Empire.
Вони не мали альтернативи в Російській імперії.
Це і чинник такий розвитку промисловості, коли
This is also a factor in the development of such an industry. When, say, one of the most powerful industries of the Russian Empire was concentrated here in Ukraine, the talk was about the coal mining, iron ore, and sugar manufacturing industries.
і цукровиробна промисловість.
In April 1917, the delegation headed by Shulhin left for St. Petersburg for negotiations with the provisional government of the autonomy of Ukraine. Those negotiations were thwarted by the Russian side. The demands of Ukrainians were deemed excessive and unacceptable.
Вони дістали перші шокові удари. Шокові удари, коли, тимчасовий уряд
They were dealt the
відмовився
first blows when the
категорично
provisional government categorically refused to consider all the issues. At first, they were fooled during the negotiations. Then, in the end, they were told that it was not suitable. That gave life to the ancient proverb. There, where the issue of Ukraine arises, is exactly where Russia's democracy ends.
Демократія в Росії закінчується.
Although Shulhin was taught a good lesson, he did not lose hope for the creation of the federation by joining efforts with other republics. In September, he became one of the organizers of the Congress of the Enslaved People of Russia in Kiev. The ways of transforming Russia into a democratic federation were discussed at that forum.
Ідея була об'єднати всі поневолені Російської імперії народи.
The idea was to unite all the peoples enslaved by the Russian Empire. That was necessary to truly make an attempt to find the algorithm of change of Russia in such a way that it would not longer continue to be the imperial monster that it is. Everyone attended the Congress, from the Baltics to the Don.
Монстром. І з'їхалися всі. Слухайте, від Прибалтів до Дону. Донські казаки прислали делегацію сюди. Ухвалені резолюції, підсумки цього з'їзду, вони мало досліджені, але вони дуже цікаві. І вони говорять про те, що така
And they show that the Ukrainian train of thought worked in an active direction. They thought about how to destabilize and divide the Russian totalitarian, authoritarian regime. It was necessary for small national entities that were part of the Russian Empire to have equal rights on that territory.
Тоталітарний режим російський, розхитати його, розділити, щоб найменші національні утворення, вони мали рівні права на цій території, яка входила до складу Російської імперії.
After the October coup in Petrograd, Shulhin, as head of the Foreign Policy Department of the UPR, sought above all the recognition of Ukraine by Western European states, France and Great Britain in particular. Upon the invitation of the Ukrainian side on December 3, 1917, a representative delegation of the Entente countries arrived in Kiev. Negotiations were conducted. George Teboué, a brigadier general, was a military representative of the Entente first in Petrograd and then was reassigned to Kiev in the late autumn of 1917. Secretary General for International Affairs Oleksandr Shulhin and Chairman of the government of the UPR Volodymyr Vinnychenko participated in the negotiations. Representatives of the Entente tried to convince the Ukrainian government that having a powerful army and controlling the situation on its territory, Ukraine would attain genuine sovereignty, which would subsequently be embodied in diplomatic recognition.
Збереглись документи, в яких країни
Documents in which the Entente countries offered Ukraine enormous assistance were preserved. Historians do not raise this issue that often, but Ukraine was offered to arm a million-strong army with tanks, aircraft and modern equipment, and instructors to teach soldiers how to use them.
Це найсучасніше обладнання, інструкторів, які б навчили солдатів.
Питання стояло про те, що
The issue was that our leadership, Vinnychenko in particular, who headed the UNR government, and Oleksandr Shulhin, who headed the Foreign Political Department of Ukraine, demanded the official recognition of the Ukrainian People's Republic by the Entente states, and they agreed to accept financial assistance.
тоді вони погоджувалися прийняти фінансову допомогу.
As the latest studies of Ukrainian history by French professor Volodymyr Kosyuk show, Great Britain and France nevertheless tried to stretch out their hands to Ukraine and give it a historic chance. They decided to accept the terms of the UPR government and recognize the independent Ukrainian People's Republic. But the news of this recognition was received too late in Ukraine. Facing the fact of the salient aggravation and the political situation in Ukraine as a result of the offensive by the troops of Bolshevik Russia, the majority of the Central Rada members deemed it expedient to conclude the Brest Peace Treaty on February 9, 1918. The German army entered Ukraine 10 days after the signing of the treaty.
Це викликало шок у Шульгіна і Петлюри.
Needless to say, that came as a shock to both Shulhin and Petlura. Shulhin spoke directly, saying, "How could we become allies with those who are already losing the war?" Shulhin and Petlura immediately resigned. These were the first examples of Ukrainian political culture when two ministers resigned because of their disagreement with the government's course. Later, Shulhin refused to take the post of Minister of Foreign Affairs in the government of Hetman Pavlo Skoropadsky, knowing about the letter's pro-Russian orientation. But in the summer of 1918, he agreed to be appointed ambassador of the Ukrainian state to Bulgaria.
Він зміг встановити надзвичайно дружні приятельські стосунки з болгарським царем Борисом, з його оточенням.
He was able to establish extremely friendly relations with Bulgarian Tsar Boris and his entourage. Very few people know it, but the undeniable colossal merit of Shulhin is that as a result of his negotiations, 12,000 prisoners of war of the First World War who were confined in Bulgaria returned to Ukraine from the territory of Bulgaria. Also, the maintenance of ships on the way to Odessa was assumed by the Bulgarian government.
Які утримувались на території Болгарії. І пароплави, там утримання, поки їх доставили до
And
Одеси.
speaks of one's diplomatic flair and ability to persuade those sitting on the other side of the negotiating table. That is, he managed to persuade Bulgarians that Ukrainians were not enemies, but quite the contrary, that they were in fact military servants of Russian Tsarism as part of the Russia army. He also skillfully convinced them the independent Ukrainian state was currently being built and that those people were needed there in Ukraine.
Російському царату, були в складах російської армії, і що зараз будується українська держава незалежна, і ці люди потрібні там в Україні.
After the directory of the UR established power in December 1918, Shulhin once again returned to his work in the international arena. In 1919, he was appointed a member of the Ukrainian delegation to the Paris Peace Conference.
Паризька конференція – це була конференція, скажімо так, переможців, тобто Антанти, яка намагалася визначитися з кордонами в Східній Європі особливо.
The Paris Conference was a conference of winners. That is, the Entente tried to determine the boundaries, especially in Eastern Europe.
Ще й поява, скажімо так,
And then there were great hopes that an even greater Ukraine might emerge, because at that time the Western Ukrainian Republic was also fighting for its existence. There were a number of different schemes that were developed and directly related to the resolution of that issue. Anti-Ukrainian Polish and Soviet-Russian propaganda on the eve of the conference, as well as the grievances of France and Great Britain for Ukraine being allied with the Germans in 1918, prevented the recognition of Ukrainian statehood.
Є такі в звітах Шульгіна, які він давав як член делегації.
There are Shulhin's reports that he provided as a member of the delegation. In his notes, he reported that he actively worked with the British delegation and the American delegation. The American delegation largely supported the idea of proclaiming the independence of Ukraine, but England and France, which at that time were key players, could not forgive Ukraine at the time. They could also not come to terms with themselves.
Вибачити Україну тоді не змогли. Вони через себе не змогли переступити.
As a result, after the defeat of the National Democratic Revolution of 1917-1921, before the Second World War, Ukraine was divided between 4 European countries. In 1921, Oleksandr Shulhin immigrated to France. For several years, he headed the mission of the UPR in Paris. In the 1920s and 1930s, he headed the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the UPR government in exile.
Шульгін, працюючи далі на дипломатичній ниві, він вже
Shulhin continued to work in the diplomatic sphere. He was ready to continue propagating the idea of Ukrainian statehood in exile to prevent it from dying and being completely removed from the diplomatic agenda.
не згасла не була знята з порядку денного.
In addition to diplomatic and political activities, Oleksandr Shulhin was engaged in historical research. He taught Western history and the history of philosophy at the Ukrainian Free University and the Ukrainian Drahomanov Pedagogical Institute in Prague. Being outside Ukraine, Shulhin tried to live with Ukraine in the same breath. In immigrant publications, he sharply criticized the policy of the Soviet government in Ukraine and condemned the Holodomor. Under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of France, he was engaged in the affairs of refugees. On March 4, 1960, the undying Ukrainian patriot, political, social, and scientific figure Oleksandr Shulhin died of heart failure. He was buried in Paris. This individual inextricably linked his destiny with his service to Ukraine and its people. He set for himself the struggle for Ukrainian statehood and independence of his native country as his ultimate goal in life, and obstinately defended those ideas until the very last minutes of his existence.